Oh, that hot cup of morning joe. Caffeine is often cited as the most widely used drug in the world. It's a naturally occurring substance found in plants and foods, and both organic and processed foods. Caffeine, though, is a stimulant that works by blocking adenosine inside your cells. And here's how this works. Adenosine is produced in the cells of the brain and other organs, and it's a chemical that's involved in inducing or bringing on sleep by slowing the activity of the cell. Caffeine is similar in structure to the adenosine molecule, so when you drink coffee and digest it, the caffeine in the coffee travels to your brain and binds to the cells and blocks the adenosine from binding. Without the adenosine to slow things down, your adrenal glands get the signal to release the flight or fight hormone epinephrine. Epinephrine, also known as adrenaline, then acts to increase alertness, increase your heart rate, and constrict blood vessels. So this is the high that you get from caffeine. It's that boost of adrenaline. Also, as an aside, the constriction of blood vessels that follow the caffeine consumption is the basis for caffeine being a part of headache medicines. It constricts the blood vessels in the brain through the epinephrine release, which gives the tissues more space and relieves some of the tension that was producing the headache. So back to the caffeine and sleep. Caffeine affects your sleep in a couple of different ways. First, it extends your sleep latency, which we know is the time that it takes for you to fall asleep. It also shortens the total amount of time that you sleep. And the older that you get, the more sensitive you are to these effects. Similar to alcohol, caffeine is a diuretic, which causes the body to lose water. So how much caffeine does it take to affect your sleep? Depending on the amount of time between consuming the caffeine and going to sleep, I'd say anything greater than 200 milligrams of caffeine would create a delayed sleep effect. A moderate dose of caffeine would be anything between, say, 200 and 300 or 400 milligrams a day. Heavy caffeine consumption would be considered around 500 milligrams a day. So what does that mean exactly? Well, let's look at typical caffeine concentrations in foods.
As you can see, there's a lot on this page, but I just wanted to point out a few things to give you a ballpark of what kind of things we consume and how it compares to a moderate caffeine consumption or low or high. So if you're one who likes Starbucks coffee, you can see that the smallest one, the short, is 180 milligrams, which that's just a little under the 200, which is a dose that can delay your sleep. But if you prefer the grande version of it, the 330 milligrams, now you're into a moderate dose of caffeine. Also, everything else on this list is lower in concentration than coffee, including Mountain Dew, which I'd always heard was what you needed to drink if you really needed to stay awake. But you really need to drink a few of them, as Mountain Dew, a 12-ounce can, only contains about 55 milligrams of caffeine, which is less than a cup of coffee. And another thing on this list that I thought was significant is the Hershey's chocolate bar. I have here that it's 1.5 ounces for 1.5 ounces of the bar, you get 9 milligrams of caffeine. Well, okay, if you can discipline yourself to only eat one of those little squares, but for an 8-ounce bar, the kind that you buy in the store, now you're getting 46 milligrams of caffeine. And no, that's not a huge dose of caffeine, but it may make a difference if you were to have that in the evening, say, as opposed to in the morning.
Keep in mind, imported coffees and teas usually carry a higher caffeine concentration, and the brewing method that you use can affect the caffeine content. Once you consume the caffeine, it's digested through the stomach and small intestines and enters the bloodstream within 30 minutes to an hour. And this is a relatively rapid response. And in fact, this is one of the reasons why a cup of coffee is so popular as that morning kick to get you going. Let's look at some of the negative effects of caffeine. We have reduced appetite, insomnia, a rapid or racing heartbeat, anxiety, headache, nervousness, irritability, and you can have gastrointestinal problems like nausea or diarrhea. The half-life is the amount of time it takes for something to decrease to half its original quantity. The half-life of caffeine varies among different studies, but is generally believed to be somewhere between 3.5 to 6 hours. It can take longer in some people with certain medical disorders or who are under the influence of certain medications. For example, birth control pills can inhibit or slow the half-life of caffeine, making it so that it takes 5 to 10 hours for the amount of caffeine in your bloodstream to decrease by half. Pregnancy and liver disease can also significantly extend the half-life of caffeine. So let's look at a practical example. Suppose you were to drink a tall Starbucks coffee at 9 a.m. That size has 230 milligrams of caffeine. If we assume the caffeine carried a half-life of 5 hours, you'd have approximately 130 milligrams of caffeine in your system at 2 p.m. that afternoon, just from that single cup of coffee at 9 o'clock in the morning. Now, this is an approximation, but because of the variability in how we metabolize caffeine, some experts recommend that you not consume any caffeine after noon, and I happen to be in that camp. I usually recommend to people that you have your last drink of coffee before 12 o'clock in the afternoon. But I realize there are those people who are able to drink tons of coffee even in the evening and never seem to have trouble falling asleep. And we really still don't know everything about caffeine. Even experts are unsure as to whether the varied responses are because of tolerance to the caffeine, or it could simply be that some people metabolize caffeine at a faster rate and are therefore less sensitive to the sleep interfering properties. My own thought is that people who drink caffeine or drink coffee after 6 p.m. Probably are not planning to go to bed 3 hours later. And it may just be that those people who do drink numerous cups of coffee throughout the day and continue into early evening are just tolerant to the stimulating effects of the caffeine. And because they normally fall asleep later in the evening, they're just not aware that the caffeine is actually preventing them from going to sleep earlier.